if you don't control the narrative of your own career brand, other people are going to start controlling it for you. And then you start to be boxed into like this person who just does this one thing. And I think all of us are way more dynamic than that. Always ask yourself this question: who am I speaking with and what do they care about?
That's Jessica Chen. She's an Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist turned keynote speaker. She's also an internationally recognized LinkedIn learning instructor and more recently the author of Smart Not Loud, How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons. And today, she's going to share some of that goodness. So you'll learn 1, the top misconception about career advancement, 2, how to ensure your message always lands, and 3, the 5 elements that make your voice resonate. I'm Pete Makaitis. This is How to Be Awesome at Your Job. And now, here's Jessica. Jessica, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, I'm excited to get into your wisdom, and I would love to kick us off by hearing something super surprising and counterintuitive you've learned over your years of studying how we can get noticed at work for the right reasons.
Well, I have to reference back to when I first started working. My thinking was, as long as you work hard and you're smart, you'll get recognized, right? Your opportunities will open up. You'll get that promotion. People will know about you. But funny enough, that's not how the world works. And it was counterintuitive to many of the things I was taught growing up in a very traditional and conservative household, where it really was just about studying and putting your head down. And so when I began my career, which at the time was as a broadcast journalist, I really figured out quickly that I had to learn some new skills because it wasn't just about being smart or being hardworking. It's being able to communicate, put yourself out there, and advocate for yourself.
Well, now I'm curious. We got to talk about the Emmy in particular. Congratulations. Not very many Emmy Award winners on the show. So tell us, that's sort of a very concrete, discrete achievement, accomplishment, which seems to suggest, hey, you've been noticed for your work. It is outstanding as recognized by the powers that be. Was that also something that you had to advocate for? Are we to understand that awards are not granted just for being outstanding? What's behind the scenes here?
So the Emmy Award, as many of you know, is considered the most prestigious award in television. And it was something that didn't happen absolutely overnight. It took me about 10 years to actually win that award. And this was when I was at the ABC station in San Diego, California. And it's funny because, and I think, if we're talking about awards and things like that, I never feel like it's something that you are aspiring or trying to get. You just do good work and hopefully people will begin to notice it. But there is an element to you have to be able to talk about the work so people know about it. So I remember for this Emmy Award, this was actually a culmination of, it really was a team effort. And I have to say that, where the story that got us that award was, so this was when San Diego was experiencing a lot of wildfires. I'm here in California, and many people know California is quite dry. And so in San Diego, during that particular year that we won that award, there were a lot of wildfires happening. And so for us in journalism, and for me particularly as a journalist, as a reporter, when you have, like, for example, a fire breaking out, your job isn't to run away. Your job is to run towards the fire, which is also counterintuitive to everything. And so I just remember our entire team did such a great job in covering the fire, safety, what was going on, where do residents have to go, where did they have to evacuate, and just the seamlessness in the execution of how everybody operated, how everybody communicated. It actually ended up being the reason why I won was because it was actually a really well-produced news story and newscast. And so again, it wasn't just about working hard, which of course you got to do. But after we finished that, it was about how can we make sure that we get the visibility for this amazing coverage that we had. And of course, we submitted it to get nominated and it got picked as the award winner and whatnot. But I think that Emmy Award is a good symbolization of, yes, execution is important, but being able to put yourself out there and talk about it is also very key.
I really dig that story because I think it's possible that you're doing a ton of stories. You're cranking them out day after day. It is sort of special for y'all to step back and realize, oh, wait, this one was really particularly excellent. Let's make sure that we put our best foot forward and pick your moment and rock and roll there.
Exactly. And I think a lot of things that I talk about, one of them is being able to celebrate your wins. And at the same time, it's not about always talking about the work that you do, but it's being judicious about, okay, I know this one I did particularly well in. How can I make sure to maximize the opportunity and ensure other people know it? Because yes, you don't need to do it for every single project, every single thing that you do. But for the ones that really stand out to you, it's thinking about how you can take that and leverage it for perhaps more opportunities, more recognition.
All right. So your book is called Smart, Not Loud. Can you hammer home the main idea or distinction we should be thinking about here with that?
So, the thesis of this book, and I really wrote this book for those who were raised in what I call a quiet culture. So, people who are raised in a quiet culture were taught principles like valuing humility, modesty, not seeking the spotlight, avoiding conflict, for example. And I teased this earlier where, growing up in a very traditional and conservative family, my parents taught me to embody these quiet culture traits. But when you go out into the working world, especially in many Western and corporate workplaces, you start to see that it's the people who are able to speak, be the first one to speak, put themselves out there, talk about their wins. These are the things that people notice, which is what I call loud culture traits. So the question is, for somebody who was raised to embody and value these traits, how can you still get noticed at work without necessarily changing who you are as a person? Because my whole thing is, if you naturally tend to be on the quieter side, or if being assertive, dominant, loud, and extroverted, if that's not your style, I don't think that's necessarily what you should do because that feels quite inauthentic. But how can you still show up in a way for you to get noticed and still unlock those bigger opportunities?
Well, that sounds handy. Maybe before we get into the particulars of how that's done, could you share with us a cool success story of someone who made a transformation doing this kind of stuff?
I'll share my own story because this is a personal journey for me too. And, like I mentioned, that was how I was raised. And I experienced a lot of friction. I call it communications friction in the workplace. And in many ways, when I started working, it was this culture shock. So I was trying to find this balance that I was talking about earlier of like, well, if it seems like the people who are loud get recognized, but that's not necessarily my style, how can I do that? And at the end of the day, a lot of it actually came down to one thing. It was communications. It was learning how to be an effective communicator. And we know communications is a very broad topic, and there's actually a lot to learn. It's about, for example, public speaking, getting comfortable standing up and presenting an idea. I think for many of us, this is not something that we are naturally born with. It certainly wasn't something that I naturally was comfortable with, or even finding that moment to communicate your idea in a meeting. I used to remember sitting in a meeting and being like, oh gosh, I have an idea. I want to say it, but instead I'm in my own head creating this narrative of like, is it a good idea? Is it not a good idea? And then before you know it, the conversation has moved on, right? And so it's funny because I always joke, even though communications was something I struggled with, because I started out as a broadcast television journalist, there was no better industry for me to learn how to become an effective communicator. And so this is to say, when you asked about like the journey, this like a person who had that transformation, I think in many ways it was for me being introspective, identifying these points of friction, and then really doubling down on leveling up my communication skills. Because once I did that, I felt like opportunities, visibility, all that completely changed.
Well, I'd love to talk about some of the particulars of communicating well and sort of getting past these friction points. But could you first share with us what is it that we want to communicate? How might we go about identifying key things worth highlighting before we figure out the how specifically to execute that communication?
The number one most important thing anybody has to think about if they're thinking, how do I make sure my message comes across the way I want it to come across, is to always ask yourself this question: who am I speaking with and what do they care about? I think for many of us, it's not instinctive for us to think about that first question because many times we're thinking about, I have this idea, I'm excited about this idea, I've been working on this project, and I know I want to talk about it in this meeting. And a lot of it is coming from your own perspective, right? And I always say, you can be presenting or talking about one topic to this group. You're in a next meeting, same topic, but different group of people. Even though your topic is the same, how you communicate it and how you tailor that needs to be different because maybe the people in group A, the things that they care about might be a little bit different than the people in group B. And here's an example. Let's say in group A, you're talking to your immediate team, and your immediate team are people who just needs to know what's going on, the execution, the nitty-gritty details, right? But let's say in group B, you're talking to senior level executives. They probably don't want all the nitty gritty details. They just want to know the high level key points and perhaps your recommendation, right? Because if you boggle them down with all the details, they might go, okay, so what's the point you're trying to say, Jessica, right? And I think as an effective communicator, we got to be really in tune with our audience, what they care about, and tailoring our message to them. That can be our guiding light and our North Star.
I like that a lot. And I'm thinking about any number of times I've received an intriguing enough cold email that got me to hop on a call for a demo of something. And I've been amazed at how fairly often folks will walk me through a slide deck. This is just like a one-on-one kind of sales conversation. They'll walk me through a slide deck and I don't care about any of that. I don't care about your founder or the history of the company or your story, where the idea came from, like the inspiration. It's like, I just want to know, can you really do the thing that you're saying you can do? Is that going to make big results happen for me? And can you show me a cool case study or how this unfolded in practice with some charts or graphs or numbers? But help us out with that. So we tend to get stuck in a world where we just think, okay, this is my presentation, so I'm supposed to give it, or I'm fired up about this, so I'm going to go for it. What's sort of the habit or practice or ritual we should use to stop and check in and get that audience info we need first?
Yeah, it's funny because the story that you just mentioned, that experience you have, a lot of it is because this person is presenting you a canned presentation that they've created. It's like, okay, getting on a call with Pete, let me just pull up the presentation that I always give, right? And here's the thing, and let's be real. Nobody has time to recreate a presentation every single time they're meeting somebody new, right? But I do think the first few minutes of, and let's just use the example of presentations, the first few minutes of you giving a presentation, that is the most critical time because, like you said, Pete, like you're ready to listen. You're like, okay, you got me on this call. I am intrigued enough to talk to you. So I'm paying attention. And so for folks who are thinking about, for example, leveling up their presentation skills, yes, we're not talking about changing your entire presentation because nobody has time for that. But thinking about how you can tailor just even the first few minutes. Okay, I'm getting on this call with Pete. What do I know about him? What is it that I feel like he cares about? And I can make sure that I start off with that because I want to capture his attention and get him really interested, right? And like you said, for you, you're like, I don't really care to know about like the founders or like whatever, that kind of stuff. But maybe to somebody else, that is important to them, right? So for the person who is engaging with you, for them to think about how can I be strategic, it's being able to identify, okay, what are the things you care about and how can I start it off to capture your attention?
And it seems like it would be totally fair in a small environment where you can, like if it's one or two or three people you're speaking to, as opposed to hundreds, to just ask, hey, so where do you want to start first? What do you find most interesting? What made you intrigued to have this conversation? And I suppose you could simply ask.
Exactly. And I think a good way is to ask open-ended questions at the beginning. And this is kind of where like the art of small talk happens, right? Before you even dive into the presentation itself, before you even pull it up and start sharing your screen with somebody, it's just kind of getting a temperature check of like this person, maybe asking a few questions. And then that can give you some pretty key insight of like, oh, I know this, or Pete said this. So maybe I can kind of like, and this can even be not just content, it can just be even tone and the vibe of how you present it, right? If you notice somebody is like pretty formal and pretty, let's say they just want to get straight to it, then you're like, okay, I got to get straight into it. Or if you're like, oh, in this small talk, I found that this person likes to chit chat, they're a little bit more casual, then maybe in your presentation style, you now tailor it to that, right? It's always basically meeting people where they're at.
All right. So you could intuit based on your observations of how things seem to be. That's super. Are there any explicit questions you recommend just straight up putting out there?
Well, this is, I mean, I'm trying to think about very specific, but I mean, even just, when we think about small talk, it's just thinking about what have you been working on, right? Or like kind of what's exciting. And I think that can give you insight of who the person is, what they're interested in, and then using that information, whether it's in the beginning of your meeting or later on in the meeting, but using that bit of insight to make it feel like, oh, I heard what this person said. And so in the middle of the conversation, you can even bring it back up. You can say, oh, yeah, and Pete, when you mentioned that earlier, when we first jumped on that call, this point that I'm about to make actually relates to that, right? So it's really making sure that you're asking questions that provide insight into this person, but then also maybe even leveraging it during your conversation to show the other person that, hey, you're listening.
Well, I am listening, Jessica, and it sounds like you're kind of touching on some of the stuff associated with your 4A sequence for speaking up at meetings. Can you lay this on us?
I have found that for some of us, being the first one to speak up in a meeting is not the most natural thing. Some of us tend to want to get a temperature check of the meeting first. They're not the first one to speak, or they tend to just want to think about their ideas before they say something, versus some people are very much about they're processing their ideas in real time as they're communicating. However, there is this 4A sequence, and this is a communication strategy specifically for people who tend to have a hard time finding that moment to speak. Because what we don't want is for somebody to have a brilliant idea and they're just keeping it in their mind and they're trying to figure out when's the right time to speak. And before they know it, the conversation has moved on. So the 4A sequence is a way of basically seamlessly inserting yourself into the conversation. And I'll walk you through the 4A. It's 4A's basically. The first A is active listening. The opposite of active listening is passive listening, which is think about when you're sitting on your couch watching Netflix, right? You're passively listening and watching what's going on, but you have no intention to chime in. And I think this is a very important mindset shift because when you go into a meeting with the intention of saying at least one or two things, it completely changes how you even sit in a meeting, whether you're leaning in and how you're paying attention. So going in with A, active listening. Once you found that opportune time to chime in, whether it's because of a pause or because somebody said something that is relevant to what you want to say, the next is you want to acknowledge. Acknowledging is you simply saying, hey, Pete, that was actually a really interesting point you just made. Or what you just said made me think of, right? You're acknowledging the person by saying, I hear you. And you can even say those words, I hear what you're saying. But what is great about this is you're allowing the person who just spoke to not feel like you're cutting them off necessarily. Because when people feel like they're getting cut off, or this is even more important to do if you have an opposing idea, is you want them to feel acknowledged so that they can go, okay, at least I was heard. You acknowledge. And by the way, acknowledging is not agreeing. It's just letting the person know that you heard them. Then the third A is anchor. Anchoring is repeating one or two words the person said right before you as a way to connect your point to their point. Hey, Pete, that was a really interesting point you just made. And when you said the word data, it made me think of A, B, and C. You said data, I repeated your word data, and that creates a connection. And then finally, the fourth is answer. Now you make your answer, your pointed statement, or whatever it is you want to say. And I have found that when you can present this acronym of the 4A sequence, it's especially helpful for people who tend to figure out chiming in and how to do it. So it's active listening, it's acknowledging, anchoring, and answering.
Okay. Well, I like those little examples there. Could you give us a full demonstration in terms of we're chatting and I guess I need to say something first that you can actively listen to. So We'll say we're chatting. I'm really excited about the opportunity to put forward this content. I think it'll be like testimonials on steroids when we interview our clients in this context.
So you mentioned the word content, and I know, Pete, you've been producing a lot of different content on this. And so it made me think of the next few episodes you're going to be creating. This is just kind of me using and repeating the word that you said. I was anchoring it to the word you said, which was content, right? I mean, I don't really have a follow-up question to what you have to say, but if I did, I'd be like, okay, Pete, okay, content. Oh, I did have a question about content. So this is how I would essentially seamlessly insert myself back into the conversation.
And what I think I've found is that when you're anchoring and repeating a word or phrase someone said, if that word or phrase is somewhat unique, distinctive, original, fresh in some way, the person who said those words that you anchor to feels a little dose of like a pat on the back or a high five or a good job for saying that clever thing. So that I just get the impression that it increases your likability, or maybe that's just me and I'm super susceptible to this kind of flattery.
No, you're totally right. And I think some of it can be very subtle. It could be also very unconscious, right? Like, if I had repeated something that you said, it kind of makes you feel, oh, wow, Jessica actually heard me, right? And it's not like I'm explicitly saying oh, amazing idea, but it's just like, yeah, it's just kind of like a little like, hey, wink, wink, like I heard you, And I think, and we think about being an effective communicator, I think we have to think about making sure we are capturing people when they're most receptive to listen. And when they're most receptive to listen, it's generally when they are feeling validated, feeling acknowledged, feeling like they're being heard, right? So I think, yes, these subtle communication tactics, which we're talking about right now, is the anchoring, repeating one or two words that person said. It can actually achieve that for sure.
We had Chris Voss on the show, the FBI negotiation dude, and he talked about that very concept of repeating the last few words they said is almost magical, even if you're doing it sort of as though you're thinking it in like a soft thinking processing kind of a voice. It's like, oh, okay, you're really considering what I'm putting forward, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Exactly. So I think when we think about being an effective communicator, it's leveraging things that are also, yes, explicit, but also very implicit too. But it's still getting the other person to feel like, oh, yeah, okay, well, let me hear what Jessica has to say next.
And you highlight 5 different elements of voice, which I think is so cool. Can you walk us through these 5 things? But first, tell us, why do we want to pay attention to our voice and what it sounds like? Is it just sort of like our voice is our voice and that's fine? Or just how much of an impact does it make tinkering with these variables?
It's funny because I think whenever I talk about tone of voice specifically, a lot of times people go, well, it's just the sound of my voice, right? Yes, but there's actually way more we can do with our voice than we think. And the 5 elements, which I will go through, are, this is not something that I produce. It's actually based off research and study and research. And I remember just for me, when I was a broadcast journalist, I remember we would have consultants come in and they would critique us on television. And they would say, do this, do that, change this, change that, just like, as consultants, that's what they do. And I remember one time I had the consultant come in and we're watching me talk on camera, doing whatever story. And she kept commenting, at least for me specifically, like the rate, the pace of my speaking. Now, when I get excited, when I'm happy, I tend to talk very fast. I think that's just kind of like who I am. Like I'm just excited. So I talk fast, especially if I'm maybe doing a story that's more upbeat, right? And I remember her saying, Jessica, you got to slow down. And in my mind, I was like, I actually thought I was talking much slower than I would normally do because I know being and talking fast is my one weakness. And she was like, no, Jessica, if you really want to be impactful, you got to speak way slower. And that's when I realized your tone of voice has many different elements. And yes, how fast you speak is the first one. So I'm going to walk through the 5 right now. So number 1, your tone of voice, the first element is really what we call your rate, how fast you're speaking. And that's kind of like the one that we think of the most because when people are nervous or excited, which is in my case, we talk fast. So The key is you can actually control and change it. In fact, you do want to have a variety. The second one is what we call your pitch, and that is basically how high or how low your voice is. Now, we know men tend to have lower pitches, women tend to have higher pitches, but here's the thing, we all have a range. If we are maybe talking about something serious, something that we want people to understand the urgency, then we might want to modulate our pitch so it's a little lower. But it's not doing it in this unnatural way. It's again, knowing that we all have a range. The third one is thinking about your intensity. So, intensity essentially is how loud or how soft your voice is. Now, typically when we are mad or angry, we will raise our voice. But sometimes when people are shy and timid, they might speak in a lower tone of voice. And the idea is you want to have variety. And I think this is like very strategic if you're thinking about, let's say you're giving a presentation and you're speaking maybe in a louder voice. And then suddenly you want to get people to know that this point is the most important. So maybe you'll slow down your rate, lower your voice, because that gets people to lean into what you have to say. The next one is what we call inflection. And that is essentially what words you want emphasized. So as you're speaking, you have a choice of this is the word that I want people to know. Like, even I'm just kind of doing it right now. This is the word that I want people to know is the most important. And that is part of your tone of voice. It's that inflection on that word. And then finally, it's what we call the quality. And that is inherently, what does your voice sound like? When somebody calls you, they're like, oh, that's Pete. Oh, that's Jessica. And we say of the five, the first four, you can control. In fact, you should change and have variety, but you can't really change what's inherent, which for some people, it might be that squeaky voice, that hoarse voice, that raspy voice, right? That's just inherently who you are.
In a way, I'm thinking about sort of like recipes. If I want someone to receive a message more like thoughtfully, let's reflect on this thing here and really kind of mellow out and be calm, we're going to have a slower rate and a softer volume intensity. And that sort of produces that, which is very different than, rally the troops onward. It's like we've got more volume and rate in that zone.
Exactly. And I don't know if you've ever even like thought so intently about tone. Maybe this is the first time you're really thinking about it because we're talking about it, but you're right. And I feel like because you're like, I have a specific intention, right? Then I need to talk and modulate my tone in this way. And even when you were just doing those two different, modulations, my feeling right now as a person listening, like I felt a certain way. And that's the thing, you controlled it. You kind of did that with your tone of voice.
Well, and not to get on a rant, but with people are amazed at AI speech to text these days. And it's very impressive technology. I'll give you that. That's pretty cool. And that wasn't around as nearly as robustly and beautifully 6 years ago, because I've tried over the years. But at the same time, boy, when I watch a YouTube video and it has an AI narrator, I can tell I get irritated because it's yes, you are saying the words, bravo, robot, but it's not giving me all the emotional things with words that are part of what make a video lovely. So that's my take. For what that's worth. What's your take on how AI plays into all this, Jessica?
Honestly, it's just going to get better.
Yeah, over time. Mm-hmm.
It's going to get better over time. It's going to sound so realistic and it's going to be scary, in my opinion, right? But where it is right now, I think many of us can tell it's very artificial. It doesn't sound very natural. And I think that's actually a good thing right now. It does kind of scare me a little bit when you cannot differentiate between, is this AI talking or is this a human talking? But right now for us, as humans to humans, that is how we connect, right? It's the emotion behind the words, the language that we're using. That's how it builds connection for sure.
Well, and then you got me thinking about news broadcasters and in particular and connection. What do I call that? The down pitch in terms of like at the end of things. And some folks, let's see, for an example, I might say, and Starbucks revenue has increased by 18%. Du. He's like the du at the end. So sometimes I get the vibes like, okay, you're done. That's what you're communicating with that is that we're done. We're over with this. But kind of my thought is from like a connection building perspective, that makes me feel like the broadcaster is more robotic and artificial and less connectable. So what's your take? You've been in it.
Oh, yeah. I have a lot of thoughts about this. And I have a lot of thoughts because I had to also get out of that broadcast mentality
Mm-hmm.
myself. Having worked in broadcast, you start to develop a quote unquote like broadcasting voice. And in some ways, it's good for like maybe more of like the nightly news, right? Where there's just really just telling you exactly like what's going on. But if you watch morning shows, for example, on television, it's way more casual, way more conversational. And that's the intent, right? Because in the morning show, the vibe is really to like connect with the audience versus I think, in my opinion, when you're watching like the nightly news, it's really about this is serious stuff we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is what's going on. This is breaking news or whatever politics and crime, whatever's happening, right? And I think for most of us listening right now, we're not trying to talk in that broadcast voice. Actually, a lot of people say, like, I want to speak like the people who talk on television. And I'm like, actually, you don't.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, maybe in the sense where they're talking very clearly, they're enunciating the words. Yes, those are all really good things. But when you're talking about just everyday speak, you really want to not talk as if you're talking to a person. You want to talk as if you're just having a conversation. And honestly, Pete, I think you do a good job with this too. Like, even though we're doing this recording together and in some ways it's quote unquote broadcasting, but it's really like we're having a conversation. And I think that's really the approach and mentality for everybody.
Beautiful. Thank you. Well, Jessica, tell me anything else you want to make sure to mention before we hear about some of your favorite things.
I would say the number one most important thing that I want people to know is whether you grew up in a quiet culture or a loud culture, or you find yourself a mix of both, right? Where sometimes it's easy to speak up, or sometimes it feels a bit harder. I think what we can do for ourselves is know that we actually can control our career brand. And our career brand is the perception people have of us in the office. So the real kind of takeaway point is when you go into work every day and you're thinking about communications, for example, or you're thinking about tone of voice or any of those things that we're just talking about today, ultimately, though, what can really accelerate any of our careers in the corporate environment or whatever industry that you're in is knowing how you can take the work that you have to do, things that people assign you to do, and how can you use it to really leverage it for more opportunities. Of course, communications plays a huge role in that. But if there's any kind of like one golden nugget, it's I want people to feel empowered when it comes to their work and knowing that they have control. Otherwise, if you don't control the narrative of your own career brand, other people are going to start controlling it for you. And then you start to be boxed into like this person who just does this one thing. And I think all of us are way more dynamic than that.
Big thanks to Jessica for sharing her wisdom with us. And big thanks to our sponsors. Check them out. One sponsor to check out is LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring, you want quality professionals who are truly the right fit for a given role. And if you're wearing a ton of hats and short on time, that can be tricky. But LinkedIn Jobs provides great tools to help you find the right professionals super fast. They've even got a nifty new feature that helps you write job descriptions in a jiffy. LinkedIn isn't just a job board, no. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job. Check this out. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit any other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/beawesome. That's linkedin.com/BEAWESOME to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. All right. Well, now could you share with us a favorite quote? Something you find inspiring.
It's the one where it's about when you think about communicating, it's not always about focusing on the words that you say. It's really about how you're making other people feel with that. And I think that's kind of the essence of why I do what I do. And when people ask me, like, oh, can you help me become a more strategic communicator? A lot of times I'm like, yes, the words that you say matter. Of course, they're really important, But let's talk about delivery and how you're saying it, because that's really what matters at the end.
Mm-hmm. And a favorite book?
I recently read a good one by Tessa West. It's called Job Therapy.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And I actually really enjoyed that book. I mean, granted, I will be biased. We share the same editor, but I really liked her book because it's a similar to kind of like how I think about career. It's a very proactive way of finding a career that makes you happy instead of the other way around, essentially.
All right. And a favorite tool? Something you use to be awesome at your job?
On my desk, I have a cup heater, and I love it because it just keeps my coffee hot all day.
All right.
But honestly, but in all seriousness, I will say, and they don't pay me to say this, but I do use this one app quite a bit to schedule meetings. It's called Motion, and that has been huge for me. I've been using that a lot.
And is there a key nugget you share that people seem to really connect and resonate with and quote back to you often and say, Jessica, that was brilliant. Thank you.
I would say you got to be your own best cheerleader. I think for a lot of us who are smart, hardworking, we do good work, sometimes we can just do the thing and then move on. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that from time to time, we got to celebrate ourselves, be our own best cheerleader. And it could be even like small little things. And one quick tip that I love to share with people is if you get an email from somebody and they're saying, congratulations, good job, awesome work, create what I call a yay folder. Drag that email into your yay folder, and that will effectively become the one place where you can find all the good work that you're doing, which is very helpful for performance review season.
And if folks want to learn more or get in touch, where would you point them?
I'm most active on LinkedIn. So do connect with me on LinkedIn, Jessica Chen. And I'm also on Instagram. So same thing, Jessica Chen page. Otherwise, our website, soulcastmedia.com, that's like another way to get in contact with me and find out about the communications work that we do.
All right. And do you have a final challenge or call to action for folks looking to be awesome at their jobs?
Yeah, find something to celebrate this week because you are going to be your own best cheerleader. So think back to the last week, what's something small that you did that you're pretty proud of, and how can you highlight it so other people know about it?
Beautiful. Well, Jessica, this is fun. Thank you and best of luck.
Thank you, Pete.
I really dug Jessica highlighting the 5 qualities of voice. And it's so useful, I think, whenever you're listening to a speaker or a recording of your own self speaking and think, this just sounds sort of dull and boring. What's going on here? I found that usually you can pinpoint it to one of these dimensions or a lack of variation in it. So just as being a monotone speaker is kind of boring, I'm just hearing the same tone, so is being a mono-intensity speaker in terms of everything is at the same volume the whole time. And I think by systematically listening to a recording or a person live and identifying which of these elements are dynamically moving versus just kind of stuck, you can find opportunities for improvement to increase the music and the fun of listening to a voice and thus the engagement as well. Great reminders from Jessica. If you want to check out the show notes or the transcript or the links to items that we've referenced, please drop on by awesomeatyourjob.com/EP990. And I hope to catch you next time, and peace.